Whether addicts are victims or not, once addicted, they must be seen as brain disease patients. Dr. Adam Leshner. Good evening. Tonight I will be informing you of the many different aspects of addiction. Tonight I hope you gain a better understanding of what addiction is and the many different factors that can affect addiction. At this time, I would like to address the three focuses of my speech, which are, is addiction merely a physical addiction, or should we clearly classify it as a brain disease? Number two, whether or not genetic variations in humans play an intricate part in the extent of the addiction, and can delta-phos-B and CREB lessen the effects of the addiction? Let's first talk about whether addiction is merely a physical addiction, or should we classify it as a brain disease. Addicts cannot distinguish between whether they are physically or psychologically addicted. Addiction does begin as a voluntary behavior, but ends essentially in a brain disease. Once addicted, the individual moves into a different state of being, and the threshold is then crossed. Human drug addiction is defined by uncontrolled, compulsive drug use despite the negative consequences that it can bring. Dr. Stephen Hyman, 2000. All addictive drugs, including psychostimulants, can produce emotional withdrawal such as dysphoria, which brings us into the brain disease aspect. Psychostimulants have both acute and long-lasting effects on behavior even after the individual has been withdrawn from the physical aspect of the drug. Even after the physical withdrawal, many patients still tend to have the craving for the drug, which proves that it does entertain the idea that the drug has affected the brain. Nextly, many researchers tend to believe that genetics play an intricate part to the extent of the drug addiction. The genetic basis of addiction encompasses two broad areas of inquiry. One of these is identification of genetic variation in humans that partially determines susceptibility to addiction. The other is the use of animal models to investigate the role of specific genes in mediating the development of addiction. Recent advances in the animal models has proved to be heartening to researchers, but the major challenge that still remains on how the many genes implicated interact to yield a phenotype such as addiction. In layman's terms, are we as humans predetermined in our genetics to have a greater susceptibility to addiction? Abnormal behaviors are a consequence of aberrant brain function, which means that it's a tangible goal to identify the biological underpinnings of addiction. Dr. Eric Nestler, 2000. Sadly, the only way that researchers can attempt to learn any knowledge is through the animal models, so a definitive answer may never be known. Lastly, can delta-phos-B and CREB lessen the effects of the addiction? Delta-phos-B and CREB are transcription factors induced in the brain's reward pathways after chronic exposure to drugs of abuse. Dr. Colleen McClung, 2003. The mechanisms of action and the genes that they may regulate remain unclear. Researchers have found that CREB and delta-phos-B have opposite effects on gene expression. Short-term and prolonged delta-phos-B reduce the rewarding effects of cocaine, whereas CREB tended to work better with patients that had short-term exposure to cocaine. These factors help define the molecular functions of delta-phos-B and CREB and identify the cluster of genes that contribute to cocaine addiction. Some of the most important biochemical, structural, and behavioral changes induced by chronic exposure to drugs of abuse appear to be mediated by highly stabilized transcription factors of delta-phos-B. Delta-phos-B indirectly regulates CCK promoter activity. Dr. Q. Aston Ashton, 2011. As we can see in my graph, this demonstrates the study in which rats were injected with saline, cocaine, and then cocaine with the treatment of delta-phos-B, and studied to see how the decreased effects of cocaine by measuring the total distance traveled by the mice. Human trials have not been performed, so to come to a positive and conclusive decision is unlikely to the variables between humans and animals. In conclusion, I hope you have a better understanding that many things are unknown and nothing more than speculation, but researchers will continue to pursue the answer of the questions in addiction. Is it merely a physical addiction, or should we classify it as a brain disease? Do our genetic variations play an intricate part in the extent of addiction? And can Delta Phos-B and CREB lessen the effects of addiction? We may never know. I hope you enjoyed my speech. Good night.